The routine stopped that wasn't. Jamal Freeman was having a good day. As he cruised through the pristine streets of his affluent neighborhood in his sleek black Porsche, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had worked hard to get to where he was, and the luxury car beneath him was a symbol of his success. His fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel as he hummed to the music playing softly in the background. Little did he know, his peaceful drive was about to turn into a nightmare. Out of nowhere, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared in his rearview mirror. Jamal's heart skipped a beat, and his mind raced through the possibilities. He hadn't been speeding. His car was brand new, and all his papers were in order. So why was he being pulled over? He pulled his car to the side of the road, his stomach tightening with a sense of unease. Officer Karen Michaels sat in her patrol car, eyes locked on the black Porsche in front of her. Something didn't feel right. In this quiet, wealthy neighborhood, seeing a young black man in such an expensive car set off alarm bells in her head. As she stepped out of her vehicle, her hand instinctively rested on her holster, and her posture radiated suspicion. She was already convinced something was wrong before she even approached the driver. Jamal rolled down his window and greeted the officer with a calm, respectful nod. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Her response was cold and direct. "License and registration." Without a word, Jamal reached into his glove compartment and handed over the documents. As he did, he couldn't help but notice the way Officer Michaels was looking at him. Her gaze flicked back and forth between his face and the car, as if trying to reconcile the two. "This is your car?" she asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Yes, ma'am. I just bought it recently," Jamal replied, keeping his voice steady even as a knot of tension began to form in his chest. Officer Michaels didn't seem convinced. She studied the papers in her hands for what felt like an eternity, her brows furrowed in skepticism. After a moment, she glanced back at him with a hardened expression. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered, her hand tightening on her holster. Jamal's stomach churned. He had heard stories like this before, stories that didn't always end well. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore, a growing crowd. Jamal opened the car door slowly, stepping out with deliberate care. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this because of the color of his skin? The thought stung, but he had no time to dwell on it. Officer Michaels was watching him closely, her posture rigid, as if she expected him to make a sudden move. He stood there, hands at his sides, trying to keep his composure. From the corner of his eye, Jamal noticed his neighbors starting to gather. One by one, they emerged from their homes, curious about the commotion. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who had lived across the street from Jamal's family for years, stepped out onto her porch. Her arms were crossed, and her face was set in a stern frown as she observed the scene. Mr. Patel, who owned the corner store down the block, stood in the doorway of his shop, watching with uncertainty. Jamal felt a wave of frustration. These people had known him for years. He had grown up in this neighborhood, played with their kids, helped them with groceries. But now, they were looking at him like he was a stranger. Worse, like he was guilty. Officer Michaels, seemingly emboldened by the growing crowd, stepped forward and began to pat him down. Her movements were rough and invasive, and her words were laced with condescension. "Pretty nice ride for a young black guy like you," she muttered under her breath. "How'd you afford something like this?" Jamal's jaw tightened. He wanted to shout, to demand that she stop treating him like a criminal, but he knew better. Any show of anger could be used against him. Instead, he swallowed his pride and stood still, letting her search him as the neighbors looked on. Behind him, the crowd was growing, their murmurs reaching his ears. Some people were shaking their heads, whispering about how kids these days didn't know how to act. Others just watched in silence, unsure of what to do. The tension in the air was thick, and Jamal felt trapped. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting against years of ingrained prejudice, against a system that saw him as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. But what could he do? Every move he made would be scrutinized. Every word he said could be twisted. He glanced around, hoping someone would step in, say something, do something. But all he saw were judgmental stares and hesitant glances. The weight of their silence pressed down on him, and he realized with a sinking feeling that he was on his own. A dangerous accusation. Officer Michaels finished her search, stepping back with a scowl on her face. "We've had reports of a stolen vehicle matching this description," she said, her voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You're going to have to come with me for further questioning." Jamal's heart sank. Stolen vehicle. This was his car. He had the paperwork to prove it, but he knew that wasn't enough. Not here. Not now. He was being accused of stealing his own car, and no amount of explanation seemed like it would change Officer Michaels' mind. "Officer, this is a misunderstanding," Jamal began, his voice measured and calm. "I have all the paperwork right here. This is my car." But Officer Michaels wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind, and the arrival of another police car, sirens blaring, only seemed to confirm her suspicions. Jamal's pulse quickened as the situation began to spiral out of control. The second officer, a superior by the looks of his badge, stepped out of the cruiser and approached with a stern expression. His presence made the crowd shift, whispers growing louder as they anticipated what would happen next. But instead of diffusing the situation, the superior officer glanced at Jamal and said something that chilled him to the bone. "Well," the officer said, his voice cold and devoid of empathy, "looks like we got another one trying to pull something." Jamal's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. He was being treated like a criminal, like a danger to society, and no one around him seemed willing to help. As the officers prepared to take him into custody, Jamal realized that the battle he was facing wasn't just against these two officers. It was against a system that had already decided his guilt before he had a chance to prove his innocence. A dark turn of events. As Jamal stood by his car, the weight of the moment pressed down on him like a crushing force. The flashing lights of the police cruiser bathed the street in an ominous glow, a signal to everyone in the neighborhood that something was terribly wrong. He glanced around, hoping for support from the faces peering through the windows and doors of nearby houses, but all he saw were cold stares and hushed whispers. The presence of his neighbors, people he had known for years, seemed to have shifted from concern to suspicion. Officer Michaels, now emboldened by the arrival of her superior, seemed more determined than ever to escalate the situation. Her posture was rigid, her hand hovering near her holstered weapon, as if preparing for the worst. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his composure, knowing that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. He felt trapped, like an animal cornered with no escape, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. The superior officer, a man with graying hair and a stern expression, stood beside Michaels with an air of authority. His calm demeanor was unsettling, as though he had seen this situation play out countless times before. He exchanged a glance with Michaels that sent a chill down Jamal's spine, a silent communication that spoke volumes. "Radio for backup," the superior officer said quietly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We need to make sure this doesn't escalate." Jamal's stomach twisted. Backup? For what? He had done nothing wrong. He hadn't resisted, raised his voice, or shown any signs of aggression. Yet here they were, preparing for a confrontation as though he was a dangerous criminal. The words "potentially dangerous suspect" echoed in his mind, twisting reality into a nightmare. Officer Michaels, with a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips, reached for her radio. "Requesting additional units to my location," she said, her voice steady and professional. "We have a potentially dangerous individual refusing to cooperate." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't refusing to cooperate. He had done everything she asked. He had handed over his license and registration without question, And yet here he was, labeled as dangerous. The injustice of it all burned in his chest, but he knew he had to stay calm. Losing control would only give them an excuse to treat him even worse. As the tension mounted, the crowd of onlookers grew. More neighbors stepped out of their homes, drawn by the spectacle of flashing lights and the possibility of drama unfolding right in front of their eyes. Jamal noticed Mrs. Johnson, who had known him since he was a child, standing on her porch with her arms crossed, her face a mask of disapproval. He had always respected her, thought of her as a second grandmother in the neighborhood. But now her gaze was cold, filled with judgment, as though she had already decided he was guilty. His eyes drifted to Mr. Patel, the owner of the corner store he frequented. Mr. Patel, usually warm and welcoming, now stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Jamal had always assumed the people in this neighborhood would have his back, that they knew him well enough to trust him. But in this moment, all he saw was a community turning its back on him. The weight of their collective suspicion was suffocating. Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder that he wasn't alone. He had friends, family, people who could help. He could call for backup of his own. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, careful not to make any sudden movements, and pulled out his phone. His fingers trembled as he unlocked it. "I'm going to call my lawyer," he announced, his voice calm but firm. He knew his rights. He wasn't going to let this situation spiral out of control without taking steps to protect himself. "Put the phone down." Michaels barked, her hand moving toward her gun. "You're not making any calls." Jamal froze, his phone still in his hand. The crowd, now a full-blown audience, watched with bated breath. It felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. Every action, every word seemed amplified, carrying more weight than it should have. "I have the right to contact my lawyer," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the growing knot of fear in his chest. The superior officer stepped forward, his face calm but his eyes cold. "Not while you're being detained. You don't. You'll follow our instructions, or we'll take you in for obstruction." Jamal's jaw clenched. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. This was about control, about proving a point. He glanced around again, hoping for some sign of solidarity from the neighbors, but all he saw were faces filled with fear, indifference, and silent judgment. No one was going to step in. He was on his own. A second police cruiser arrived, and two more officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts. Jamal's heart sank as the situation continued to escalate. He hadn't done anything wrong. And yet here he was, standing in the middle of his own neighborhood, surrounded by police, being treated like a criminal. The superior officer nodded to Michaels. "Search the car." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. "You can't do that without a warrant," he protested, his voice rising slightly in panic. "You have no right." "Step aside, sir," the superior officer interrupted, his tone sharp. "We have reasonable suspicion." Jamal opened his mouth to argue, but he knew it would be futile. The power dynamic was clear. They had already made up their minds about him. He stepped back, his hands shaking with frustration and fear as Michaels opened the driver's side door and began rummaging through his car. The search was invasive, every movement a violation of his privacy. Michaels rifled through the glove compartment, the back seat, and even the trunk. Jamal clenched his fists, his heart racing as he watched her dismantle his life, piece by piece, in front of the entire neighborhood. Suddenly, she froze, her hand hovering over something in the glove compartment. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face as she pulled out a small baggie filled with a suspicious-looking substance. Jamal's blood ran cold. "That's not mine," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I've never seen that before." But it was too late. The superior officer nodded, his expression grim. "Looks like we got ourselves a drug dealer," he said, his voice dripping with false authority. Jamal's world spun. Everything he had built, his reputation, his career, his future, was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was a takedown, and Jamal was the target. Framed and defenseless, Jamal's heart pounded so hard, it felt like it would burst out of his chest. The small plastic baggie in Officer Michael's hand glinted under the harsh lights, a symbol of the nightmare unfolding around him. His mind raced, trying to piece together how this had gone so wrong so quickly. It wasn't possible. He didn't use drugs. He never carried anything illegal, and there was no reason for that bag to be in his car. Yet here it was, an undeniable reality that threatened to consume everything he had worked for. "No, no, no," Jamal muttered, his voice trembling as the crowd looked on in horrified silence. "That's not mine. I swear, I've never touched that in my life." The superior officer, who had been standing with a cold and detached expression, slowly approached. His eyes, once dispassionate, now gleamed with something more sinister, a flicker of satisfaction. "You know," he began, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "That's what they all say. Everyone's innocent, right?" Jamal's mouth went dry. He knew what was coming next. His stomach turned as the superior officer motioned for Officer Michaels to place him in handcuffs. The metallic clink of the cuffs being removed from her belt echoed in the quiet street, the final nail in the coffin of his innocence. As the cold steel closed around his wrists, Jamal felt the weight of his freedom slipping away. He had always believed that if you did the right thing, if you stayed calm, followed the rules, respected the law, things would turn out okay. But in this moment, he realized just how fragile that belief was. It didn't matter how many good decisions he'd made in his life. The narrative was being written without his input, and in it, he was already the villain. The neighbors who had once smiled at him on the street, who had waved to him in passing, now stood frozen, watching as though they were witnesses to a distant tragedy. Some pulled out their phones, filming the scene as though they were capturing a moment to share later over dinner or on social media. But no one spoke up. No one dared challenge what was happening. Jamal was left to bear the weight of this injustice alone. "Turn around," Michaels barked, forcing him to face the car. "You're under arrest for possession of illegal substances." Jamal whipped his head around, panic rising in his throat. "I don't even know where that came from," he shouted. "You've got to believe me. I've never." The superior officer cut him off with a single raised hand, as if Jamal's words were a mere nuisance. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, his tone almost bored, as though this was just another routine arrest. Silent, Jamal thought. How could he remain silent when his entire life was being dismantled before his eyes? He couldn't afford to be silent. He needed someone, anyone, to listen, to believe him. "You don't understand." Jamal's voice cracked, desperation creeping in as his pleas seemed to fall on deaf ears. "This is a setup. I've been working late every night. I don't do drugs, I don't carry them. Check the cameras. Talk to people who know me." But the officers continued as though he wasn't even there. His words seemed to bounce off of them, lost in the abyss of their indifference. His mind scrambled for something, anything that could stop this runaway train. His lawyer, that was his only hope. He needed to get in contact with someone who could see through this farce. "I need my phone. Please, just let me call my lawyer," he pleaded, his eyes searching the crowd. A few faces turned away, uncomfortable with the raw vulnerability in his voice. But Michaels only scoffed, tightening the handcuffs around his wrists. "You'll get your one call at the station. For now, just keep quiet. You're only making this worse for yourself." Making this worse for himself, Jamal thought bitterly. What could be worse than this? The superior officer approached again, his presence looming like a storm cloud over Jamal. "Son," he said quietly, his tone almost condescending, "you can either cooperate with us and make this easier, or you can keep fighting and dig yourself deeper." Jamal shook his head, incredulous. "I'm not fighting. I'm telling you the truth. This is a mistake." But the officer's face remained emotionless. "Mistakes happen," he said cryptically, turning away as if to dismiss Jamal entirely. Officer Michaels began leading Jamal toward the police cruiser, her grip firm on his arm. Jamal's legs felt like lead as he walked, the stares of his neighbors piercing into him like daggers. The humiliation burned in his chest. Every step toward the backseat of the squad car felt like a step further into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. As they approached the cruiser, Jamal's gaze flickered to the rearview mirror, where he caught his own reflection for a brief moment. His eyes, wide with fear and disbelief, stared back at him. This wasn't him. This wasn't his life. How had things unraveled so quickly? But then something caught his attention. Something small, barely noticeable, but enough to ignite a spark of hope. In the reflection, just behind the police cruiser, he saw a figure, slender, hooded, and slipping into the shadows, a fleeting silhouette that seemed out of place in the otherwise frozen scene. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He didn't recognize the figure, but there was something strange about the way they moved, like they were deliberately trying to avoid detection. His mind raced, connecting dots that hadn't seemed connected before. Could it be? Was someone watching this whole thing play out from a distance, unseen by everyone else? "Hey," Jamal shouted, twisting slightly in Michael's grip. "Did you see that? Behind the cruiser. Someone's there." But Michaels yanked him back, shoving him roughly toward the backseat. "Knock it off," she snapped. "We're not playing games here." Jamal's pulse quickened. Whoever it was, they were gone now, swallowed up by the darkness of the street. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Was this figure somehow involved in the sudden appearance of the drugs in his car? Was he being set up by someone lurking in the shadows? As he was shoved into the back seat of the cruiser, Jamal's mind raced, desperately trying to cling to this thread of hope. If someone was watching, if someone had planted that evidence, then maybe there was a way to prove his innocence. But how? The door slammed shut, trapping him inside the cruiser. The police radio crackled to life as the officers exchanged a few words with dispatch, confirming the arrest. Jamal leaned his head back against the seat, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as the reality of his situation settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He had no idea who that figure was, or if they would ever resurface. But in that moment, as the cruiser pulled away from the scene, and his neighborhood disappeared behind him, he realized one thing with chilling clarity. This was bigger than a traffic stop. Someone out there wanted him gone. An enemy in the shadows. The police cruiser rolled away from the familiar streets of Jamal's neighborhood, the flashing lights reflecting off storefronts and houses as they passed. The tightness in his chest only grew, his wrists aching from the steel cuffs digging into his skin. Every jolt of the car sent a ripple of discomfort through him, but that wasn't what troubled him most. His thoughts were spiraling, frantically racing back to the hooded figure he had spotted just before being shoved into the back of the cruiser. Who was that? The streetlights passed in a blur, and Jamal's mind began stitching together fragments of memory, trying to make sense of the situation. The figure had been standing in the shadows, deliberately concealed, and yet they hadn't run until he noticed them. It was as if they were observing, waiting for the arrest to play out, like they wanted to make sure everything went according to plan. A cold shiver ran down his spine. This wasn't just about the drugs planted in his car. It was deeper than that. Someone had orchestrated this, had carefully arranged for him to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now that someone was watching it all unfold, Jamal's mind shifted to people who might want to hurt him, competitors from his past jobs, an old enemy from his childhood. No one stood out, but whoever it was, they clearly had influence. How else could they get police officers to play along with this farce? The police cruiser pulled into the station, its engine humming quietly before going silent. Officer Michaels yanked the door open, and Jamal was hauled out with as much care as one would give to a sack of garbage. The building loomed in front of him, gray and imposing, with harsh lights glaring down at the entrance. A deep, sinking feeling settled in his gut. This was where it all began, his descent into a system designed to keep him trapped. Michaels and the superior officer escorted him inside, their expressions cold and mechanical. The station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, adding to the sterile, suffocating atmosphere. As they approached the booking area, Jamal caught glimpses of other detainees, some slumped in their seats, others pacing anxiously. But none of them seemed to carry the same sense of shock and confusion that weighed on him. They knew why they were here. Jamal didn't. "Sit down," Michaels ordered, shoving him onto a hard metal bench. "You'll get your call when we're ready." Jamal glared up at her, his wrists still bound tightly by the cuffs. "I want my lawyer." "Now." Michaels raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a sneer. "You think you're special or something. We've got a process here, and you're going to follow it like everyone else. You'll get your call when we say so." Jamal clenched his jaw, biting back the urge to snap at her. Arguing would get him nowhere, and he knew it. But the frustration bubbled beneath the surface, threatening to explode. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore. He was fighting for his life, for the truth to be revealed before it was too late. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity as he waited in the booking area. Officers moved around the station, conducting their duties with detached efficiency. Meanwhile, Jamal's mind remained fixated on the figure he had seen. If he was right, if that person had something to do with his arrest, then he had to find a way to expose them. But how? He was trapped in here, and whoever it was could be out there, erasing any trace of their involvement. Finally, after what felt like hours, Michaels approached again. "You're up," she said, jerking her head toward the phone booth on the far wall. Jamal stood, the cuffs still tight around his wrists as he was led to the booth. The phone dangled from the receiver, waiting. His heart pounded as he picked it up with trembling hands, dialing the number of the only person he trusted, his lawyer, Malcolm Hayes. Malcolm was more than just a lawyer. He was an old friend, someone who had seen Jamal through tough times before. If anyone could help him navigate this nightmare, it was Malcolm. The phone rang once, twice, and then finally, Malcolm's deep, steady voice came through the line. "This is Malcolm Hayes." "Malcolm." Jamal's voice cracked, his emotions finally bubbling over. "It's Jamal. They got me, man. I've been arrested." There was a pause on the other end, and then Malcolm's voice hardened. "Arrested? What happened?" "They planted drugs in my car," Jamal whispered, glancing around the station to make sure no one was listening. "I swear, man, I didn't do anything. They pulled me over, and suddenly this bag of drugs appears out of nowhere. This is a setup." Malcolm didn't hesitate. "I believe you. Stay calm, Jamal. I'll be there as soon as I can. Don't say anything to the cops, and don't sign anything. We're going to get to the bottom of this." Relief washed over Jamal, but it was fleeting. He trusted Malcolm, but even Malcolm's legal prowess might not be enough to stop what was happening. This wasn't just about the law. It was about power, manipulation, and control. Whoever had set this in motion wasn't going to back down easily. As Jamal hung up the phone, Michaels appeared again, ready to lead him to a holding cell. But as she reached for his arm, her radio crackled to life. "Unit 34, respond to a disturbance at the east side of the station. Unknown individual seen tampering with vehicles." Michaels paused, frowning at the radio. "We're on it," she muttered before turning to the superior officer, who was standing nearby. "Let's check it out. You, take him to holding." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. An unknown individual tampering with vehicles. Could it be the same figure he had seen earlier? Before he could say anything, he was pulled away by another officer, this one much younger and less experienced than Michaels or her superior. The rookie officer avoided Jamal's gaze as he led him down a dimly lit hallway toward the holding cells. His grip was loose, almost nervous, as though he wasn't used to dealing with situations like this. The station was eerily quiet as they walked, the air thick with tension. Jamal's thoughts were racing again. Could that figure outside the station be connected to all of this? Was it possible that they were trying to cover their tracks or retrieve something they had left behind? The rookie officer glanced over his shoulder nervously, as if sensing Jamal's unease. "Hey," he whispered suddenly, his voice barely audible. "You didn't hear this from me, but something's not right about this whole situation. I've been with the force for a few years now, and I've never seen an arrest go down like this." Jamal's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" The officer hesitated, clearly conflicted about what he was about to say. "Look, I don't know the whole story, but I overheard Michaels and the superior talking earlier. They were mentioning something about orders from above. Like this wasn't just a regular bust. Someone high up wants you taken down." Jamal's stomach churned. Orders from above. That could mean anything. A rival in the corporate world, someone with political connections, or worse. Whoever had orchestrated this was playing a dangerous game, and Jamal was just a pawn. "Do you know who's behind this?" Jamal asked, his voice low and urgent. The rookie shook his head. "No, but I do know that you've got powerful enemies. Be careful, man. Once you're in that cell, you're going to be on your own." Jamal swallowed hard, his mind spinning with new possibilities. He had suspected a setup from the beginning, but now it was clear that this was bigger than he had imagined. Someone with influence, someone who could pull strings within the police force, wanted him out of the picture. And they weren't going to stop until they succeeded. As the officer opened the door to the holding cell, Jamal's mind raced. He had to find a way to fight back. But how do you fight an enemy you can't even see? As the cell door clanged shut behind him, Jamal's thoughts turned once again to the figure he had seen outside the police cruiser. That shadowy presence had been watching him, observing his downfall with cold detachment. And now, they were still out there, lurking in the shadows, pulling the strings of his life. But Jamal wasn't going to go down without a fight. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, he would find them. And when he did, he would make sure they regretted ever coming after him. Because Jamal wasn't just a victim. He was a survivor, and he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The pressure builds. Jamal leaned back against the cold, unforgiving wall of the holding cell, his breath steady but shallow. The metallic clang of the door closing had left an unsettling echo in his mind. But it wasn't the confines of the cell that unnerved him. It was the invisible web closing around him, tightening with every second. Time crawled by, each tick of the clock feeling like a taunt. He could feel the weight of the walls pressing in, the sterile, suffocating environment gnawing at his composure. This place wasn't built for justice. It was a machine, cold and indifferent, designed to grind people down. But Jamal wasn't going to let it break him. He sat there, hands still cuffed, his mind churning through the details of the last few hours. That hooded figure who had been watching his arrest, the rookie cop who had whispered about orders from above, the drugs that had mysteriously appeared in his car, all of it fit together like pieces of a puzzle. But the image forming wasn't clear. What did they want from him? Why go to such lengths to ruin his life? Jamal closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He needed to stay focused. Panicking now wouldn't help. He had Malcolm on the case, and the one thing Malcolm was famous for was his ability to dig up dirt. If anyone could figure out who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, it was him. But Malcolm wasn't here. Jamal was. And if he wanted to survive the night, he had to keep his wits about him. Footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the cell. They were slow, deliberate, almost as if whoever was coming was in no rush to get to him. Jamal opened his eyes and sat up straighter, his muscles tense. He didn't know who to trust anymore. The door opened with a groan, and to Jamal's surprise, it wasn't one of the usual officers. It was a man in a dark suit, sharply dressed, with a calm, almost chilling expression on his face. His presence exuded authority, and there was a palpable sense of control about him. This wasn't just some detective or high-ranking officer. This man was someone with real power. "Mr. Williams," the man said smoothly, his voice measured and polite. He stepped into the cell and closed the door behind him with a soft click. I'm Special Agent Miller. I work for a government agency that deals with sensitive matters. Jamal's eyes narrowed. Government agency? What kind of agency? Miller smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The kind that prefers to stay out of the public eye. We handle situations like yours. Complicated, high-profile cases where the stakes are much larger than what appears on the surface. Jamal's pulse quickened, but he kept his face impassive. What do you want from me? Miller took a seat on the metal bench opposite Jamal, his posture relaxed as if he were discussing the weather. I'm here to offer you a choice. You've been caught up in something much bigger than a simple drug charge. The people who have orchestrated this, let's just say they're part of an international network with vast resources. They want you out of the way because you've become an obstacle to their plans. Jamal frowned, his mind racing. Obstacle? What plans? Miller leaned in slightly, his gaze sharpening. The kind of plans that involve controlling governments, industries, and global markets. The drugs in your car were just a means to an end. They needed to discredit you, silence you, because you've been poking around in places you shouldn't. Jamal shook his head, confusion clouding his thoughts. I haven't been poking around anywhere. I'm just a businessman. Exactly, Miller replied, his voice low and smooth. A businessman with powerful connections. Your recent dealings have drawn attention from people who don't want competition. And when they feel threatened, they act. Jamal's stomach churned. He had suspected that something bigger was at play, but hearing it confirmed in such a matter-of-fact way was unsettling. So what? They framed me. And now you're here to clean up their mess. Miller chuckled softly. Not exactly. I represent another interest, an interest that's willing to protect you, but only if you're willing to cooperate. Jamal raised an eyebrow, his suspicion deepening. Cooperate? How? Miller's eyes gleamed with an almost predatory intensity. You have information they need. Contacts, business relationships, data that could expose certain operations. You may not even realize it, but you're sitting on a goldmine of intelligence. We can offer you protection in exchange for that information. Witness protection, immunity from prosecution, a fresh start. Jamal stared at the man, his mind racing to process what he was hearing. This wasn't just about drugs. This was about power, real, dangerous power, and now he was caught in the middle of it. I'm supposed to trust you, Jamal said, his voice laced with skepticism. You show up out of nowhere. Tell me I'm being targeted by some shadowy organization, and now you want me to work for you. Miller's expression didn't waver. You don't have to trust me, Mr. Williams, but consider your options. You can stay here, wait for the trial, and hope that your lawyer can pull off a miracle, or you can come with us, and we can make this all go away. It's your choice. Jamal's heart raced. He didn't know what to think. On one hand, Miller's offer sounded too good to be true, but on the other, staying here felt like a death sentence. If what Miller was saying was true, then the people behind this setup wouldn't stop at just framing him. They could ruin him completely, or worse. But there was one thing that didn't sit right with him. If you're here to protect me, why are you offering me a deal instead of just pulling me out of here? Miller's smile returned, cold and calculated. Because nothing in this world comes for free. We need assurances. You give us what we want, and we make sure you disappear safely. But if you refuse, well, I can't guarantee what happens next. Jamal felt his hands clench into fists. The weight of the decision was suffocating. He had always prided himself on being able to handle difficult situations, but this was beyond anything he'd ever faced. Betraying his contacts, giving up information, selling out. It wasn't who he was, but at the same time, his life was on the line. He took a deep breath, his mind swirling with possibilities. Could he trust Malcolm to pull him out of this? Was there another way to fight back against these faceless enemies? Or was Miller right? Was this his only way out? Miller stood up slowly, smoothing out the creases in his suit. "I'll give you some time to think about it. But don't take too long. This offer won't be on the table forever." As Miller turned to leave, Jamal's voice stopped him. "Why me?" Jamal asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Why go through all this trouble for a guy like me?" Miller paused, his hand on the door. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes gleaming with a strange, unsettling intensity. "Because, Mr. Williams, you're worth more to them dead than alive. And to us, you're an asset. Think about that." With that, the door clicked shut behind him, leaving Jamal alone once again. The room felt even colder than before, the weight of Miller's words settling heavily on Jamal's shoulders. He had known things were bad. But this was a whole new level of danger. He wasn't just facing a prison sentence. He was caught in a game far bigger than himself, and the stakes were life and death. Jamal leaned his head back against the wall, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing. He was at a crossroads. One path led to betrayal and survival. The other, to fighting back and risking everything. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone make his decisions for him. Not Miller, not the mysterious organization, not anyone. No matter what happened next, Jamal was going to take control of his own fate. And if they thought he was just going to roll over and play along, they were in for a rude awakening. A choice of shadows. Jamal sat in the cell for what felt like an eternity, the ticking clock on the wall the only sound that marked the passing of time. The offer from Special Agent Miller replayed in his mind over and over again, but no matter how hard he thought about it, the implications kept weighing him down like lead chains around his chest. He knew what accepting the deal meant, becoming a pawn in a shadow war he didn't even fully understand. A life in witness protection might sound safe on the surface, but it was an illusion. He'd be trading one prison for another. A life of hiding, constantly looking over his shoulder, relying on faceless strangers for protection. Sure, they'd erase his criminal charges, give him a new identity, but what would he lose in return? His freedom, his integrity, his ability to trust anyone, ever again. On the other hand, rejecting the offer meant facing these invisible forces on his own. Whoever had framed him had power, resources, and the willingness to ruin his life with a snap of their fingers. The drugs in his car, the whispers from the rookie cop, the cold way the system had turned on him. It all pointed to something massive and implacable, something ruthless. Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands rubbing his temples as if trying to ease the pressure building in his skull. He needed to think clearly. Every instinct in his body told him not to trust Miller, not to get involved with anyone who could stroll into a police station and offer a deal like that without blinking. But then what? What was his next move? He wasn't some lone hero in a movie, outsmarting shadowy figures and taking down international networks on his own. He was a businessman, and while he had sharp instincts and a good head for negotiation, this was beyond his experience. There were no balance sheets or contracts to leverage here, only survival. The door to the cell creaked open again, startling him from his thoughts. He looked up, expecting to see the cold eyes of Special Agent Miller, but instead, a much different figure stepped inside. It was a woman this time, dressed casually in a dark jacket and jeans, her black hair tied back into a tight ponytail. She had an air of calm about her, but not the calculated, predatory calm of Miller. This was someone who was used to slipping under the radar, moving quietly in the shadows. Her eyes scanned the room briefly before locking onto Jamal's, and there was something behind them that told him she wasn't here as part of the official story. "Jamal Williams?" she asked softly, though there was an edge of urgency in her voice. She closed the door behind her, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure they were alone. Jamal tensed, his instincts immediately on high alert. "Who are you?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the unease crawling up his spine. The woman stepped closer, crouching down so that she was at eye level with him, her expression serious. "My name's Serena. I'm with a different organization than Miller. You've been targeted by more than just some criminal syndicate. There's a deeper game going on here, and I'm here to make sure you don't fall into the wrong hands." Jamal raised an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. "Wrong hands? You mean like Miller's?" Serena nodded, her gaze intense. "Miller's group isn't who they claim to be. They're not offering you protection. They're looking for control. The people who framed you are connected to a global operation, and Miller's faction is just one part of a larger machine. They use people like you, Jamal, turn you into assets, leverage your connections, and once they're done with you, they discard you." Jamal sat back, his mind reeling from this new wave of information. "So you're saying I'm caught between two sides of a power struggle?" "Exactly," Serena confirmed, her tone grim. "You're valuable to them, but not for the reasons they've told you. Your business, your contacts, everything you've built, it's a goldmine for both sides. But you're also a threat. You know too much, and they can't let you operate freely. They'll either pull you into their fold or destroy you." Jamal rubbed his hands over his face, trying to process what she was telling him. "Why should I trust you? How do I know you're not just another player in this game?" Serena sighed, standing up and pacing the small room. "You shouldn't trust me," she said bluntly, her back to him. "In fact, don't trust anyone right now. But if you want to get out of this alive, and on your own terms, you're going to need help. My organization doesn't want to control you. We want to give you options. The world you're stepping into is dangerous, but there are ways to fight back." She stopped pacing and turned to face him again. "But you need to decide quickly. Miller's offer won't stay on the table for long. If you take it, you're walking into a trap. If you don't, we can help you disappear before they get to you." Jamal felt his stomach twist. "Disappear? You mean run?" "No," Serena corrected. "Not run. Fight back, but on your terms. We can give you the tools, the resources, but you'll need to be smart. You'll need to play both sides, gather information, make them think you're cooperating while finding a way to expose them." Jamal shook his head. "This is insane. I'm just a businessman. How am I supposed to take on people with this kind of power?" Serena smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth in her otherwise serious demeanor. "You're more than just a businessman, Jamal. You've survived in an industry where deals are made and broken with lives on the line. You've navigated some of the most ruthless corporate landscapes. You know how to negotiate, how to read people. That's why they want you." Jamal stood up, pacing now himself, the weight of everything crushing down on him. "And what if I say no to both of you? What if I decide to handle this on my own?" Serena's expression darkened. "If you try to handle this alone, they'll crush you. The people behind this, they don't lose. They don't let loose ends walk away. You might think you can outsmart them, but they've been doing this for decades. They've toppled governments, destroyed entire industries, and erased people from existence. You can't fight them alone." The cold certainty in her voice sent a chill down Jamal's spine. He stopped pacing, staring at the floor, his mind racing with the enormity of his situation. Every option felt like a trap. Trusting Miller, trusting Serena, or even trusting himself to find a way out. But as much as the idea of running or hiding terrified him, the idea of being a pawn in someone else's game was worse. He had spent his entire life building something, carving out his own path, and now it was all being torn away by forces he couldn't even see. Jamal looked up at Serena, his decision slowly solidifying in his mind. "You said I need to play both sides. What does that look like?" Serena's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "You pretend to take Miller's deal, get close to him, learn what his faction is after, and feed that information back to us. In the meantime, we'll help you protect your assets, make sure your business stays intact. But you need to be careful. One wrong move, and they'll know." Jamal exhaled deeply, his pulse racing as the weight of the decision settled over him. It was risky, dangerous even, but at least it was a plan. A plan that let him maintain some control over his fate. "All right," Jamal said finally, his voice steady. "I'll play their game. But the second things start to go sideways, I'm out." Serena nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll make sure you're ready. But remember, trust no one. Not Miller, not his people, and not even us completely. The only person you can rely on in this is yourself." As Serena turned to leave, Jamal felt the crushing weight of the situation finally lift, if only slightly. The game had changed, but now, at least he had a piece on the board. He wasn't going to be anyone's pawn. He'd find a way to turn this around, no matter the cost. The door clicked shut, leaving Jamal alone once more, but this time, his mind wasn't filled with doubt. It was filled with the cold, hard focus of someone who knew they were going to war.